Good morning, Resurrection. It's good to be in the house. It's good to be here, and before I begin, I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for welcoming me home. I want to say thank you to your pastor, who I met not that long ago, for an opportunity to preach the gospel today. And I don't take it for granted you've entrusted me with this sacred responsibility, and in so doing, providing me the opportunity to fulfill my purpose. But I just wanted to make sure that, although I know he's already exasperated with all the white in celebrations, that I wish my dad happy birthday. Thank you. All right, let's go to work now, because I got a word for you today. Would you please stand for the reading of the word? If you would, please turn with me to the 126th Psalm. I'll be reading verse 6 from the King James Version. He that goeth forth and weepeth, bearing precious seed, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him. You may be seated. Today, I would like to share with you the good news of the gospel through this discrete, particular, ancient narrative encapsulated in a singular verse. It's written from an ancient person whose community has gone through a large degree of suffering and come out of it at the hands of the Babylonian, post-return from the exile in Babylonia. And he's looking back on the pain that they've gone through and saying of all that he has had to suffer, metaphorically, he, the protagonist, representing the entire Judaic civilization, looking back on all that he's had to go through and saying, it's worth it. The psalmist speaks to us today in our condition from all those eons ago and reminds us that no matter what we're going through on God's green, good earth, it's worth it. Now, I don't know about you, but this is not necessarily an easy message to receive. And I imagine it's a difficult message for anyone on this side of eternity to appreciate. Because not only does it fail to comfort me, I don't know about you, but when I'm in pain, the last thing I want to hear is that my pain is good for me. Not only does it fail to comfort me, but it actually contradicts me in my core. Because from the time I was a baby, my entire set of material behaviors, from my cry to my style to my smile, have been deliberately constructed in pursuit of pleasure. In fact, ever since I began to recognize myself as an entity distinct from the world in the mirror, the only thing I can know for certain is that I've wanted to have fun. Now, there are those out there, and I'm sure among you, who shudder at the thought that all I want to do is have fun. And there are some who would even go so far as to intimate and imply, if not assert, that fun and the pursuit thereof is a sin. Yet I believe and know to be true from my own experience that the pursuit of pleasure is at the very core of every decision I make, for good or for bad. I don't intentionally decide to do anything I really believe will only harm me. And if I do anything that harms me, I only do it because I also imagine or understand somehow that it will help me. Take a close look at yourself and you will discover that your entire life has been organized in one way or another in the pursuit of personal pleasure. And I say this not to make you feel guilty or selfish, but just to be honest about what it is that truly motivates us to do what we do. And it is, in fact, on this basis of common desire, which we all share, that I believe it becomes easiest to enter into an authentic relationship with God. As the late great Christian existentialist Soren Kierkegaard once said, in order to be a person of faith, you must have an infinite and intense personal interest in your own pleasure. I know it may seem contradictory to much of what we learn in church. Love your neighbor, love God, serve others, sacrifice in the name of love, humble yourself, cease to be selfish, turn from your wicked ways. And all that's true. But I would assert to you today that if you don't want to have fun, then any pursuit of these things is ultimately fraudulent. You don't really believe that it's good. You're doing it out of duty or out of fear, not because you are actually passionate about the will of God. See, the word for love really means to choose. Agape means to choose what God desires and to prefer it morally in the original Greek. And so what I'm saying is that in order to really believe God is good, you've got to do what he says, because what pleases God pleases you. And not because you're afraid of pain that you will experience if you don't obey it. In other words, fun is only a sin if what you think is fun is sinful. And you know it's easy to get confused. Solomon told us about it in the book of Proverbs. He said, for the lips of a strange woman drop as a honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil. But her end thereof is bitter as wormwood, sharper than a two-edged sword. Her steps lead down to death. Her feet take hold on hell. I don't know about you, but that don't sound fun to me. But it can seem fun, and we often get confused by how the devil tries to make things seem beautiful and not realize that even the devil has been cast to the earth and made ugly because of the decisions that he has made. And I digress, but the point I make is that I imagine that everyone sane and honest will admit that pleasure above all else is what we desire, and pain above all else is what we despise. So when someone looks at me, either from the past or the future from any vantage, and comes and details the pain of my life, which is not like everyone else's pain. I've had a privileged life, I'm not gonna lie. But I still got white people problems. But when anyone looks at my life and tells me that getting my Range Rover stuck on the beach is good for me, and tells me that it's worth it, I want them to take it off my plate for me. Well, if it's so good to you, why don't you take it yourself? If pain is really good, why don't you experience it for me? And no matter every day how much I desire pleasure, I'm frustrated by the fact of pain. The fact of pain. On a personal level, from the time I get up in the morning, or from the time I want to get up in the morning, because I don't always get up when I want to get up, I experience, as we all do, personal pain. On a first level, we experience constant resistance to everything we try to do good. And it doesn't matter what the thing is. If we want to eat, well, we got to chew. We got to pay for the food. If I want a six-pack, I got to eat less and exercise. I'm working on it. And exercise more. If we want to go somewhere, well, we got to get there. And no matter what it is, none of it ever seems to be quite effortless. No matter how pleasant, there's always a dimension of constant resistance that accompanies every instance of pursuing pleasure. No matter what you do, no matter how many times you got over it before, it never goes away. So the question becomes, at least at first, immediately, how can we put up with it? How can we deal with it? How can we relate with it? If the last thing we want is pain, and the only way to get any pleasure is to suffer, then what do? In our text today, our lachrymose protagonist, who figuratively represents the entire people of Israel, also must face the seemingly constant resistance, or had to face rather, the seemingly constant resistance of everyday captivity. They woke up every day not knowing whether or not they'd be able to eat and knowing for certain that the labor of their own hands did not belong to them. Sound familiar? And every effort they made to bless themselves was co-opted into a blessing for someone else. And while victims at a crime scene, they were commanded to rejoice and sing a song of Zion in a strange land, to dance and laugh and be happy. And so in response to the constant resistance, which is captivity, our protagonist has nothing left to do but cry. He that goeth forth and weepeth. But wait a minute. He's crying, but he's still going forward. He's not crying in place. And that's the problem. When you become immobilized by your tears, you miss the lesson of resilience. The solution contained in the text to the experience of constant resistance is resilience. He that goeth forth and weepeth. He's crying, but he keeps going. He's in pain, but he's still after pleasure. He doesn't let the potholes in the road keep him from driving. He doesn't let the turbulence in the air make his wings recoil. He keeps on flying. He faces constant resistance, but from it he learns the lesson of resilience. Resilience. Yet the pain we experience in our personal lives is not always constant and is not always so small to be categorized as resistance. Sometimes we suffer from acute pain, however temporary, that we can only describe with the excruciating calculation called tragedy. When we're thrown in jail for a crime we didn't commit. Tragedy when a son or daughter is stripped from their parents before their time. Tragedy when we're going through hell and all we've ever given out is heaven. Tragedy when KFC ain't got no chicken. Tragedy. And the truth is that sometimes there's no real answer to tragedy, no temporal solution that will redeem our time or restore all that we seem to have lost in the twinkling of an eye. Tragedy strikes, and all we are able to do, even at our best, is simply to endure it. This endurance also, which is the substance of patience, which literally means long suffering, is a lesson we can also extract from our protagonist today, who can do nothing with his pain sometimes, but simply bear it. He that goeth forth and weepeth, bearing precious seed. Sometimes the only answer to our questions is a period, which is a punctuation only Father Time can provide and determine the arrival of when no man or woman, even angel, knows the time. In other words, long suffering is at times the only way we can handle our pain. And we must go on with the belief, as Yolanda Adam puts it, that this too shall pass. Patience is the second lesson we can learn from our personal pain. But sometimes a personal pain, even worse than constant resistance and even more consistent than the tragedies we temporarily face, surfaces within, and we find ourselves at war on the inside. In the pursuit of pleasure, sometimes we can't make up our minds on what exactly will bring us pleasure. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Romans 7, why do I do the things that I don't want to and don't do the things that I do? I find a law then that when I would do good, evil is present with me. And so we have decided that we want to make music, but we won't put in the time to learn an instrument, or we want to write a book, but we can't quite get our fingers to move, or we want to feed the poor, but we're too cheap for bigger pots. We want one thing now, another thing yesterday, and something altogether different tomorrow. We're inconsistent. And no matter how much we meditate or pray, we find ourselves wrestling with the personal pain of internal conflict. Nevertheless, once again, like our passionate protagonist, whatever, we've got to learn how to doubtless come again. He that goeth forth and weepeth, bearing precious seed, shall doubtless come again. In other words, we've got to learn how, in spite of our internal conflict, to show up again, to try again, to be diligent, to choose to do things that are difficult, because the reward for the difficult is the beautiful. And make no mistake, diligence hurts, which is why in Hebrew, the word for diligence literally comes from the root karat, which means to cut. And sometimes circumcision, and sometimes the only way to escape the pain of eternal conflict is through the process of diligence, which itself is also painful. And this is the process of faith too. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. He that comes to him must believe that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. The process is painful of faith. And I don't know about you, but I'm beginning to get frustrated with the capacity of our text to explain away all of this pain. Not to mention, we've only discussed personal pain. And most pain is social. The problem isn't me, it's other people. It's other people that get on my nerves when they leave food in the sink, when they know it would take like 30 seconds to rinse it out, or leave wet clothes in the dryer, who get on my nerves when I'm driving. Other people are the ones who are selfish. Other people disagree with me. Other people hurt me. And some of the people in this room have been hurt by other people. You've been abused. You've been abandoned. You've been ignored. You've been betrayed. And you're wondering with me how an ancient text from another society could possibly explain the lesson in what you've had to go through, or possibly provide you any comfort, or even worse than that, you're beginning to wonder not merely how all of this pain could be related to, how we can endure it, not merely how all this pain can be managed and dealt with, but what it all means and why it has to exist. Why does anyone have to suffer? And even more than that, why do I have to suffer? The dilemma grows even greater when you realize that pain is not just personal or social, but some pain can be expressed only in the grandiose terms of the word evil. Evil when a people is robbed of their identity and culture. Evil when a people is systematically killed for their religion or the color of their skin. Evil when people are oppressed on the basis of their gender. Evil when I've served you my whole life and you still let me behind. Evil no matter how, when entire nations are subjugated and murdered for money and land. Evil. And when we stop to consider the nature of the world, we find that evil even goes beyond other people. We find evil in nature. Predators, hurricanes, typhoons, monsoons, Katrina, Pompeii, volcanoes, COVID. And the carnage on the shores of history is lined with the bodies of people whose murderer could not be identified because it's somewhere in the air. Evil without a culprit. And the more we think about all this evil and this pain, it becomes more than merely a material pain. It becomes an existential pain, a heavy question that we're forced to carry with us into every situation that only compounds the slightest or the most severe into the most excruciating. And it transforms from an existential pain into a spiritual pain. It becomes the reason why we don't believe in God or have a relationship. Because how can we believe in an all-powerful and loving God? A God who is just and good. A God who is a provider and providential. When all this pain is there too. And the question becomes far more than an abstract philosophical one. How can God be good and let my son die before his time? How can God be good when my mother is sick and has been so bad to me and I don't want to care for her? How can God exist when no one has ever loved me like I deserve to be loved and how I've loved other people? How can God be true when everybody lies to me? How can God be just when my money certainly ain't? How can God be a provider when I go to bed hungry? How can God be real when my pain crying on the bed at night, my pain sleepwalking through the day, my pain seeking deeper and deeper into addiction, my pain failing to achieve my goals at every turn, my pain facing rejection on every front, my pain messing up every good opportunity I get, my pain? How can God be real when my pain is too? Here is the point, the breaking point. the broken and humble position of existential and spiritual dread, of desperation for an answer, any answer at all to the ghoulish lacerations of our daily lives. From the message, this place is the only place from which we can receive the message of our text today, from which it becomes so poignant and persuasive, and indeed becomes quite necessary. He that goeth forth and weepeth, bearing precious seed, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him. Bringing his sheaves with him, the curious last phrase. I didn't quite understand it at first. I thought that a sheave was a scissor when I first read it. But a sheave is not a set of scissors. A sheaf or a sheaf is a bundle of grain. In other words, every time you're carrying the precious seed of pain, and every time you want to question it, instead you've got to get ready to reap it. Because the harvest is coming. Every time you're feeling sad, the harvest is coming. And every time you feel exasperated by other people, the harvest is coming. And every time you can't quite make your ends meet, the harvest is coming. And every time you sink in doubt, the harvest is coming. And every time you face your fears, the harvest is coming. And when you know when and you don't know why, but the harvest is coming. And I could go on and tell you about the harvest I've seen in my life, how my knee injury led me into debate, which got me into Harvard, or how I had a mental breakdown during COVID that brought me to God and restored my relationship with my Father. I could tell you about the harvest I've been through and the harvest I've seen in my life, or I could tell you about the harvest in your life, about the harvest of this church, about the harvest of all that it's been through, the harvest of all that it's achieved. But I get a sense that you're starting to mistrust my experience and even your own. So let me tell you about the experience of someone greater. See, I know a man who had a very painful life. He was born somewhere in a barn, and they laid him in a feeding trough where filthy domestic animals used to eat. He was a refugee before he could walk, and his entire family had to flee their home to escape a systematic genocide and persecution of their youth. He was raised in an obscure village. Let's just say it wasn't the center of attention. And he grew up poor. When he was old enough to work, he worked a menial job until he was 30 years old. And even when he started working, those closest to him, when he started doing miracles and feeding the masses and healing the sick, those closest to him never fully understood who he was. And the people he loved most hated him so much that they released a career criminal just so that they could kill him. And on the way to his death, they whipped him and they mocked him. And when he was dead, they pierced him in the side, or as he was dying, as if the nails in his hands and his feet were not enough. Pain. He had a painful life. No one ever understood him. No one appreciated him. And every now and then I can hear people talking about his pain. They say that he was rich, but for our sakes he became poor, that through his poverty he might make many rich. They say that he was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. They talk about his pain. They say that before he died, he was in a garden sweating like blood. They talk about his pain so much so that millions of people wear the instrument of his death around their necks. They talk about his pain. But today I can hear him talking, seated on the right hand of the Father with all power in his hand, looking back at all he had to go through on the other side of exile. And I hear him speaking through the words of the prophet Isaiah, saying that he's satisfied with the travail of his own soul, because the righteous servant who was afflicted, who suffered much, the righteous servant through his knowledge justified many and bore their iniquities. I hear him speaking to us today that it's worth it, that all he endured is worth it, that he despised the shame of the cross, but for the joy that was set before him, he endured it. And it was worth it. And every now and then I hear people talking about how many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. And I hear people mention how this light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us an eternal weight of glory. I hear people talk about how all things work together for the good of those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. I hear people talk about it's worth it. All that we've had to go through, all that we've had to endure, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. It's worth it. And in the end, we must believe this truth that God offers us today through this text. Not because it's easy, not because it's always comforting, not because it always makes sense, but because it's true. And the truth will set you free. I believe that if we walk with God long enough, we will come to find out why it's worth it, and we will see that it's worth it. And I pray that all of us get the chance to look back on the other side of eternity at all that we've had to go through and are able to say, it's worth it. Amen.